My name is Corey Zoli. I'm a research faculty member at INSCIT. I'm very pleased to introduce Isaac Kfir, my colleague at INSCIT, who is also a visiting professor in international law and international relations at Syracuse University. I could very easily take up all of our time today describing the breadth and depth of Isaac's research agenda. It's huge. And that doesn't even include his expansive and award-winning teaching portfolio. But I'm not going to do that. You can check out his bio on the INSCIT website, and you'll be impressed. For brevity's sake, I want to pull out a dominant thread in his work. Isaac is an AFGHAN, an international human rights law specialist. And I want to give you a sense of what a strange and rare and unique thing that is to be. So Isaac is a Brit who comes to us in the way of Israel. He was a faculty member at the Untitled Chapter in Herzliya. And he decides once he gets to the US Academy, in the post-9/11 moment no less, he decides he will study one of the most inscrutable and challenging of all contemporary security dilemmas. And that is the conflict dynamics comprising Afghanistan and Pakistan today and how they affect the rest of the world. These countries' internal and external dynamics, as we all know now, created the foundational motivations and conditions that led up to 9/11, which it was itself a symptom of broader worldwide changes in global conflict patterns and the very nature of war. And by the way, Isaac decides he's going to do all of this the hard way, not from a US national security bias, but from a holistic interdisciplinary perspective that blends international law, social science, and security studies. From a level of difficulty perspective, this is at the tippity top. So what does Isaac's research look like? In trying to understand AFPAC, Isaac has predicted that contemporary sectarian violence in Pakistan today will shape our future 9/11s. There's going to be a direct relationship between local sectarian violence in Pakistan and regional and international conflict and security dilemmas of the future. Second, he has written about how our very best efforts on the part of the international community to structurally build in stability into Afghanistan, like UN peacekeeping operations, have not only gone hopelessly awry, they have actually undermined that fragile state's capacity for security. He has also written about how women's rights in Pakistan are not just a local issue or a special interest topic, but a pivotal national and international security lever. You should feel free to ask him about these questions as well, because he's a wealth of information on them. For today, continuing these broad themes, Isaac will lecture on reconciliation in Afghanistan, lessons learned from Morocco and Eastern Europe. His thesis is a tough one. It's basically that of Afghan political failure, basically failure of political will, and how we, the US and the international community, have not been able to get Afghanistan into a reconciliation program, because to do so would threaten Afghan political elites with criminal liability. Rather than have their power scrutinized or constrained in any way, Afghan political elites would rather sacrifice the stability of their country, hold on to illusion of power, and even return to civil strife. That's a serious problem. Definitely ask Isaac questions about policy options under these extreme circumstances. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Isaac Kfir.
Thank you very much, Corey. That was an amazing introduction. I really appreciate it. It's going to be difficult for me to contain my ego after that introduction. So as Corey kind of illustrated, my thesis is relatively straightforward. I argue that really in the post-9/11 period, in the post-Cold War period, we really do need to engage in some sort of reconciliation for societies transitioning out of conflict. Now, the normal approach is to simply engage in prosecutions. However, in Afghanistan, I'm going to argue that that's simply not possible because the main stakeholders all hold power. And they're not going to have somebody examine their activities during the various conflicts that Afghanistan had experienced. What was interesting is that in 2010, there was in fact a report that was issued examining some human rights violations. And that report has been suppressed. The report itself was drafted by the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. And when it was debated in the Afghan cabinet, one of the vice presidents, Marshal Fahim, actually said that the head of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission should be shot in the face 30 times for even proposing such a thing. So, I mean, this is some of the challenge that the Afghan people are facing. Now, what I'm going to try to propose is that because prosecutions are not a viable option in Afghanistan, we could look to Morocco or we could look to the lustration system in Eastern Europe as a way to devise some sort of a reconciliation system. Now, I am not suggesting that the Morocco Truth Commission was a perfect fit. I'm not suggesting that lustration is a perfect fit. And there were some serious problems with those two systems. But again, we have to work with what we have. So one of the things that I'm going to try to suggest is how can we draw lessons from those two experiences as we assist Afghanistan address past wrongs. So this is kind of my outline. I'm going to start from an international legal perspective, if there is a duty to prosecute and why should we prosecute. I want to spend a little bit of time discussing transitional justice and post-conflict justice. These are two very different terms. I want to emphasize that Afghanistan has embraced international criminal law. They have signed up to various treaties. I'll talk a little bit about the Afghan political reality in the post-9/11 period, and then of course today as Afghanistan is transitioning out of the ISAF period and is heading towards election. And then I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation through truth commissions. So first and foremost, it's important to note here that transitional justice is a very poorly defined concept. It's something that commentators and those of the students here who have taken my class on PCR are very much familiar with. It's something that we really struggle to define. Now, generally the approach is that post-conflict justice refers to retribution justice, when you have prosecutions. So you're going to have a very small number of individuals who are going to be indicted for wrongdoings. Transitional justice, however, tends to talk more about truth commissions and other form of reconciliation. Now, the emphasis here is very much when you're dealing with post-conflict justice with preventing further atrocities. The argument is, if people are going to find out that they're going to face prison, they're not going to do any wrongs, or at least they're going to try to prevent committing various atrocities. And the second thing, and I think this is super important, and I'll address that a little bit later, it empowers the victims. One of the things that we do see in conflict is that victims, and here again we can focus more, for my work at least, I focus more on women and children, and I'm not trying to put them both in the same category because both need to be addressed differently. But very often, women and children do suffer enormous harm in such element, and very often they do feel as if their rights have been taken away from them. So we really need to empower victims to, first of all, tell their stories, and secondly, feel that justice has been provided, that somebody is being held accountable for their suffering. Now, under international law, this is very much the legacy of Nuremberg and Tokyo. There is an assumption, there is a view that those who commit international crimes, and here I'm going to stick to the three main ones, crimes against humanity, war crime, and genocide. Of course, in the post-ICTY and ICTR, we can add sexual violence. It's going to be very important. We can talk about crimes against women, crimes, more specifically sexual crimes also against men, and so on. But really, there is a pretty strong consensus that when it comes to international crime, somebody needs to pay the price. However, that raises a very difficult issue in terms of sovereignty and power. States are very unlikely to want to prosecute those who committed violations, especially if those are the leaders that are governing the country. So one of the things that, again, that we are going to face as international prosecutors is how am I going to persuade the country to permit me to engage in forensic investigation? Right? Forensic investigations are ever so crucial. Now again, one of the things that we've discovered in Afghanistan is 180 different mass grave sites. Now there's probably many more. But trying to find them, again, it's going to take a lot of time, takes a lot of permits, a lot of ability to speak to the government to allow us to do those things. We also need to interview witnesses. Now again, in traditional societies such as Afghanistan, how am I going to interview, for example, a woman? I need to ask her husband's permission in some cases, or at least a male relative. Again, that could be tricky. That also means that I may have to engage in female prosecutors or female peacekeepers. But that in itself is going to be very difficult. The other thing is, how do I make arrests? I know that some of you have taken Professor Crane's atrocity law class. Okay? He often tells the challenge of trying to arrest Charles Taylor. Again, we see that also currently with Omar al-Bashir and other individuals. So all of those are going to be a very, very important issue when we are trying to execute the duty to prosecute. And this is sort of when it comes to the victims. Victims have rights, and we have to stand up for them. We have to speak for the victims, because sometimes they're unable to speak for themselves. Now, under, again, international law, victims have three principal rights. One of the key ones is, of course, the right to know. They need to know who did what to them and why. Okay? You know, when we break up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, we want to know what we did wrong, right? We want closure. Same thing here, okay? People demand closure. And this has to occur both on an individual level and on a collective level. Okay? Because also the society needs to know, or the community needs to know, why did they suffer that abuse? Why were they targeted? There's also, of course, the right for an individual to face their accusers, or at least their tormentors. They need to, again, to be able to look at them in the face and say to them, you really caused me a lot of pain and suffering. And again, this is something that we learned from the South African case, with the case of Eugene de Brock, who was one of the leaders of the security services. And he never identified with his victims. He simply saw them as enemies of the apartheid state. It's only after he became to see his victims as human beings did he understand the suffering that they also endured. Finally, also, victims have a right to a remedy, and this can take place in terms of restitutions, compensation, and of course rehabilitation. A lot of these individuals are going to suffer enormous psychological damage. Somebody needs to help them work through the pain and suffering. And again, when I'm talking about the individuals, it could also be the extended family. These are just some of the issues that we're going to have to face. There is, of course, the question of amnesty. One of the things that we did see in the post-Cold War period for a lot of countries transitioning out of conflict is the usage of amnesties. Now, amnesties are enormously controversial. The general view of international human rights activists is that amnesties should be made illegal, or at least are illegal, under international law. I would qualify it by saying blanket amnesties are probably illegal. Okay? Again, one of the challenges that we are facing is that amnesties. We have an amnesty bill that was adopted in Afghanistan in 2007, which essentially allowed a lot of those who had committed violations to escape prosecution, or at least to claim that they do not have to justify their actions. And the other thing also to note is that amnesties can take both a criminal and a tort element. So sometimes, again, you as an individual may want to seek damages from the individuals. If you have an amnesty provision, you may be prevented from seeking private prosecution. In terms of international criminal law, Afghanistan, of course, has experienced decades of violations. When we catalog the violations, we see them from a domestic perspective. This is going to be a key issue. The different groups, the different ethnic groups, the different mujahideen groups fighting amongst themselves and with external actors also. And I'll come to that a little bit later. So one of the key issues that we're seeing in Afghanistan is the legacy of the Afghan jihad. Now, the violations that had occurred here occurred both on a domestic level and on a regional level. So on a domestic level, one of the curious aspects of the period is that Afghans did not take prisoners of war. So when the Afghan government, the socialist government who was supported by the communists, engaged with the mujahideen, there were no POWs. Individuals were simply executed. So again, we're seeing, as a result, we see violations in terms of war crimes. There were also, of course, violations against specific groups. Sometimes the government would focus on one ethnic group over the other, and that in itself would create tremendous amount of animosity and a lot of hatred. As you saw, again, the Soviets had over 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, and the country was really ravaged by the war. One of the tactics of the Soviets was to simply use carpet bombing, to saturate the area before they sent in their troops. Now again, by our standards, that would be a war crime, and of course also at the time it was a war crime. But there were nobody spoke out at the time. As you can see, the Soviet military strategy was indiscriminate aerial bombardment, which also suggests that those individuals need to be prosecuted for what they had for the crimes that they had committed. The use of anti-personnel mines. There was a general campaign of terror and collective punishment. There was one very clear example in September of 1982 where Soviet troops entered the village and essentially burnt 105 villagers alive in an irrigation tunnel. Again, those individuals need to have need to be accounted for what they have done, but also the villages, what they had suffered, need to be catalogued. When the war ends in 1988, Afghanistan descends into a period of civil war. Now again, it takes a number of years, but the war was between the 7 key mujahideen groups. This was a very, very vicious and nasty war. If we're looking at one incident, one of the leaders of the mujahideen, Hiktamar, surrounded the city of Kabul and just used artillery rockets against this city. It's reported that around 30,000 people died during that bombing. Okay? Are we hearing any demands for accountability? No, but we should. So for a very long period between 88 and until the rise of the Taliban, of course, there was enormous amount of violations. Then we have the Taliban period. From the mid-1990s until they were removed from power in 2001, they themselves committed many violations against the Afghan people. Again, that also needs to be taken into account when we're going to address the issue of reconciliation. This is a challenge. Now, we know that at the moment there is a low-intensity Afghan conflict occurring. We also need the Taliban. So does that mean that we're going to give them a pass for what they had done? So it's going to be a very difficult challenge for a reconciliation process. I also wanted to show you that Afghanistan has signed up to many international legal norms and international legal conventions, starting from the from various international human rights, the Convention Against Forms of Torture, the Convention Against Discrimination of Women. So even within Afghan law, and the 2004 Constitution makes it very clear that international law is applicable to Afghanistan. So the Afghan government, if it wanted to, could prosecute under these conventions. There is also an Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. Again, the Article 58 of the Constitution calls for the establishment of an independent human rights commission. And in 2005, they adopted a piece of legislation, the Law on the Structures, Duties and Mandates, which essentially declares that the commission needs to monitor human rights abuses in Afghanistan, needs to promote and protect human rights, monitor access to fundamental human rights, investigate human rights abuses, and of course take measures to promote and protect human rights. Now, the work of the Commission has been very difficult. Even though it's mandated under the Constitution and under legislation, they do face enormous opposition. They, of course, also face lack of funding. So the Commission itself needs to be, on the one hand, commended because, as I mentioned to you in the beginning, they have attempted to engage in a report to catalog the violations that had occurred between December of 1978 until 2001. The report is about 800 pages long, but nobody has a copy. Now, this is a problem because initially when the Commission sort of mentioned the report, immediately there was enormous opposition from the Karzai government to issue it. It appeared for a very, very short period on the UN human rights, on the UN refugee website, and then it disappeared. And I have tried through numerous channels to try and get the report, and it's been next to impossible. But it is, from what we understand, it is a very good indictment as to the violation that had occurred from 1978 until 2001. And again, here the period is also very important. Why 1978? Why not start with 1973? When the King Zahir was overthrown by his cousin Prince Dawood. That instituted a very long period of violations. And when are we stopping? 2001, December 2001, which means we're not going to discuss what has happened since the US-led invasion of Afghanistan. That is also a problem. The Afghan judiciary, however, is going to be our main challenge. Okay? The Afghan legal system operates on 3 separate levels. We do have a state-based system. In the West, we would describe it as secular. I don't like to use the phrase secular because in Muslim countries, it carries very different connotation. But so let's call it the state system. What's remarkable about that system is that there is enormous tension between the Supreme Court, the Attorney General's office, and the Ministry of Justice. They simply don't like one another, don't like to talk to one another, and are constantly vying for position. And supremacy. As a result, that affects the system. Unfortunately, corruption is rife within the Afghan judicial system, okay? The official one at least. This is why one of the things that we keep hearing nowadays is that individuals are turning to the Taliban courts to get justice. Because they say, 1, it's fast, and 2, it's much more effective and honest. Third, judges in Afghanistan are very poorly trained. Now, again, there are some very well-trained judges, but if you look at the Supreme Court, there is not a single woman judge on the Supreme Court. Some of the judges were only trained through Sharia law. That's going to be a problem if they have to implement and adopt state-based legislation. And finally, there is enormous tension between the religious courts which are in operation, and state law. And again, this is very much to do with the way Afghans study the legal profession. You can either go the religious way or you can go the state way. If you look at the Kabul law department, it's fragmented between those 2 approaches. It's one of those things, again, that needs to be addressed. So let me now move to my 2 case studies. Why do I think Morocco is a good case? Well, first of all, Morocco is the only Arab country to date that has used a truth commission as a means to address past wrong. Now, there's been a truth commission of sort in Qatar to address the violations that had occurred under the Arab Spring, but we've only had an executive summary, and there has been some issues with the way it was structured. So again, Morocco, I think, is a really, really good case here. The Arab world definitely looks to Morocco as seeing a good case as a society that is slowly transitioning towards democracy. Again, from a women's rights perspective, there's been tremendous reform of family law in Morocco. There's been, for example, an attempt to reduce polygamy in Morocco. Nowadays, marriages, the property right, the property has to be registered under the husband and the wife in Morocco, at least in theory. Okay, it's going to take time to implement, but it's something that to emphasize. The other thing to note about Morocco that is very significant is that civil society in Morocco played a very important role in establishing the Truth Commission. King Mohammed VI respected the civil society groups and embraced a lot of their approaches. And finally, it was limited. Now, the reason why it's positive, because one of the things that we learned, for example, when we look at Guatemala, is that if you have a very expansive Truth Commission, it loses itself in the evidence. It also tends to irritate a lot of very powerful individuals. So here again, they came to a very clear understanding as to what was possible. So, for example, one of the things, and this is a major criticism, there is no discussion as to the culpability of the royal family in the violations that had occurred in Morocco. Now, it's interesting that they opted for that, but it's also understandable because the king in Morocco is deemed to be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. So if I'm going to start criticizing the king for various violations, it could be seen as if I'm criticizing Islam or the Prophet. So you have to sometimes work with what you have. So the commission itself was known as the Equity and Reconciliation Commission. It was established, the process began in the 1980s under King Hassan, who was in fact the person responsible for most of the, under whose governorship most of the violations had occurred. But by the mid-1990s, there was tremendous demands for some form of reform, and there was also a growing desire to recognize past wrong. The commission itself was established on January 7th, 2004 by King Mohammed VI, the son of King Hassan. So essentially, the son followed what the father had begun. The mandate, again, was very interesting. Okay? First and foremost, establish the nature and the scale of gross human rights violations that had occurred in the past. Now, the period is known as the years of lead in Moroccan history. But again, you can see it's just about establishing, taking a thematic approach to gross human rights violations. Secondly, to continue to investigate cases of forced disappearance, examine facts not being made clear in relations to the forced disappearance, reveal the fate of those who have disappeared. This is often a very important thing. Families of those who have lost loved ones want to know what had happened to them. Okay? People want to go to a gravesite and mourn a loved one. It's a very important element in the closure process. So here again, this was a very important demand of the civil society groups. It's also, of course, seeking to propose appropriate measures for those cases in which death has been established. Property rights. What happened if the father disappeared? Who inherits the property? So that's also a key issue here. The third thing was to determine the responsibility of state organs. So again, we're not talking here about individuals. Now this is a criticism, clearly. But again, you work with what you have, or what you are able to do. And finally, to compensate for the moral and material losses suffered by the victims and their legal successors. Now, the commission, again, provided damages that ranged from $600 to $300,000 for those who were proven to have suffered during the years of lead. In terms of the composition of the commission, again, it's also very interesting. We have 17 members. Half came from the Human Rights Advisory Council, which the king appoints. So you could almost see them as maybe members of the state entity or the state organs, and others came from civil society. So again, this was a very important issue. They did provide an archive of over 20,000 personal memories and testimonies. It's organized in a central database in Rabat. They held conferences, they held seminars, they examined the past in Morocco. And this is also was very interesting. Some of the commission's hearings were televised. And I cannot emphasize how important that to a society transitioning out of conflict. People need to see those kind of events happening. So this was also a very important element. Let me now move to Eastern and Central Europe. Lustration now, it's been 20 years since really the adoption, has come under enormous criticism. But at the time, a number of people saw it as a very effective way to address past violation. Now, it's important to emphasize that lustration is not a singular system. Okay? Different countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe took different methods. So an example, the Polish model allowed individuals, in order to hold office, a person did not need to prove that they did not collaborate with the security services. Whereas, for example, in Albania, they had to show that they had not collaborated. Again, you can talk about the size of the population and those kind of issues as an explanation, but it was very, very different. It is also noteworthy that when you're looking at Eastern Europe and Central Europe, only really Romania experienced a bloody transition. Most of the other states experienced a very peaceful transition in 1989. And that is also arguably why people opted for lustration. There was concern that if I'm going to start challenging the socialist and the communist governments, the military, and especially those who are going to be accused, are going to rise up and prevent peaceful transition. So again, lustration is generally understood to be a form of institutional and symbolic change. Institutionally, it would result in a bureaucratic turnover, removing individuals from positions of power, and symbolically, it demarcated a break with the past. Both processes are intended to work in tandem to restore public trust. Now again, there is very clear evidence that a lot of the individuals who were affiliated with the communist parties, had committed violations, had managed to stay in power. This is sort of why we talk about inclusive, exclusive, and reconciliatory lustration. And so the inclusive type allows for some measure, for some individuals to remain in their office. Exclusive is that if I can show that you collaborated or worked with the communist parties, especially in relations to human rights violation, you'd be out. And finally, and this has now become the model, reconciliation, if you show contrition, you could stay in power. But again, part of the things to do with reconciliation is that you have to say, I'm sorry. You have to provide some sort of an explanation. Again, it's not a perfect system. But we have to think the alternative could be violence. And again, one of the other interesting things about lustration, which is now also being explored more, is the role of Western Europe in pushing Eastern Europeans to embrace lustration. There was concern that Eastern Europe is going to turn into enormous cauldron of violence. So let me kind of sum up with the challenges, because I really wanted to give you guys more time to discuss the various issues. The key challenge is going to be the election in 2014. Technically speaking, President Karzai is supposed to step down. He's only allowed to hold 2 terms in office. It's going to be interesting to see who is going to succeed him. Now, it could be one of his vice presidents. It could be Fahim, it could be somebody else. Again, it's unlikely, but it's possible. It could be the head of the security services. One of the things that, again, we are very concerned about is to see ethnic tension reoccurring in Afghanistan on a much larger scale. We may see, tensions between the Pashtun, the various Pashtun tribes, or of course between Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, and so on and so forth. So the election in 2014 is going to be very, very important. Again, if you if you are the West, if you're also the Afghan people, you may be very concerned. You may say, you know what, I'm not going to go down the justice route because the first thing I want to have is a stable political system. And if I'm going to start talking about prosecution, it may lead Afghanistan back to the period of civil war. The other thing to note is that by 2014, ISAF is supposed to leave. So let's say Afghanistan does descend into violence again. Who's going to help end the conflict? Can I trust the Afghan National Army to stand up and do it? Again, the jury is still out on whether the 300,000 army and security services will be able to do it. There's a lot of questions about their abilities. So this is going to be a very, very important challenge to face. There is enormous tensions and tremendous mistrust between the different Afghan groups. And we see it now with the Afghan High Peace Council. The current High Peace Council is seen as being too close to the Pakistanis, which of course then creates tension with the Karzai government. And that's also going to create tensions with some of the other minority groups. Again, if we're going to try to establish some sort of a legal mechanism, I need to have consensus. I'm unlikely to have that if groups mistrust one another. External actors are going to also play a major role. You know, we're often going to think about the US, but Pakistan is going to be key here. Iran is going to be very important. The Iranians will say, listen, we want some sort of justice mechanism for the 18 Iranian diplomats who were killed in Mazar Sharif in 1998. What about also the Taliban who are living in Pakistan? People like General Dastum allegedly killed 2,000 Taliban prisoners. Again, shouldn't even, we may not like the Taliban, but again, the execution of 2,000 soldiers, it still requires some sort of justice mechanism. And finally, the deterioration of relations between the Afghan government and the US. The Afghan government relies on US financial support. So if the Americans decide, you know what, we've had enough of Mr. Karzai or his successors speaking ill of us, giving us a hard time, why should we give them money? And again, once the money goes, because also there is no tax basis, what's going to happen in Afghanistan? So on that kind of note, I'll say thank you and I'll open it up for you all. Yes.
I think I had huge frustrations with the rule of law issues in Afghanistan. We've spent a lot of effort helping Afghan police with detain known criminal, murder, that kind of thing. Yeah. We take the prisons and quickly release them because they become vulnerable because of the government. How do we incentivize the government to actually have blind justice?
It's going to be very difficult. I don't think it's possible in the near future. One of the things that is being done at the moment is increasing the salaries, both of police officers and of judges. And of course, the third thing is education. There's a new crop of Afghan law students coming through. It's going to take another generation before the Afghan legal system is going to be solid enough. But at the moment, it's just perseverance. And again, this is where religion can come into the fray. Again, we may have to turn to village elders. We may have to turn to more traditional judicial systems and alternative dispute resolution to try and figure how we can marry the two together. I don't think it's healthy to say we're just going to go down the state way. There is again, Afghanistan is a largely traditional normative society, so we have to bring them into the equation. Now, that's going to require a lot of support from the international community that is very hesitant about those types of dispute resolutions. We saw that in Rwanda with the Gacaca system. The human rights community was simply up in arms, and so that's something that has to be addressed. But yeah, time, and money.
Yes, George. My frustration with illustrations is that in Eastern Europe, illustration was primarily based on secret police files. So in Afghanistan, how are we assigning guilt solely on a collective group basis, or is there any individual determination?
Well, so this is also important to emphasize which period of the violations are we looking at. Are we looking at 1973 to 78? Are we looking at during the Afghan jihad against the Soviet? Are we looking during the Civil War? So if we're looking at the first period, we're unlikely to see any documents, because whatever they were have probably been destroyed. If we're looking at the culpability of the Soviets and the crimes that they had committed against the Afghan people, if we troll through the archives in Moscow, we will definitely find orders, we will definitely find evidence to suggest that certain individuals need to bear greater responsibility. During the Civil War, again, we're unlikely. It's going to have to be testimonies. It's going to have to be, and this is also where forensic evidence is going to be very important. I mean, here in Afghanistan, we're going to have to employ an army of forensic scientists to help us dig through all of the mass graves that have emerged throughout the country. So it's going to have to be a combination of things. But unfortunately, we're not really going to see a lot of, as was the case in Nuremberg with Justice Jackson, who was determined to convict the Nazis on the basis of the documents. In Nuremberg, we barely saw any witnesses testifying. Here, we're going to really have to rely on witnesses and forensic evidence. And that's going to be a challenge as well. Yes?
I mean, you just talked a lot about the countries like Morocco, it's in Europe, where the ethnic groups of those countries kind of, committed atrocities against each other. Yeah. But I think the Afghan case is a bit different, because here you have other international actors involved. You have the Russians coming, and you just talked about 105 villages, one of which was mine. And my uncle was one of them who died. And you have the Pakistani generals commanding, Taliban forces during the Taliban war, and the Iranians involved, the Saudi Arabia, and all these countries. And now, in the past 10 years, you have someone has to, go and investigate all the atrocities committed by the international forces there as well. I mean, there has been so many mistakes done, and in some cases those were really intentional. Yes. Not maybe by the countries, but by individuals. So there are grievances inside the country. There are the kill team, and there are so many other small groups or individuals that they have committed crimes. Now, what would be the solution for that? Like, as an Afghan, I would not just say, okay, you just bring the proxies and then prosecute them. Yes. Because they were proxies. They were just used by Pakistan, Iran, the Western world. And just forgetting about the Russians, yes, and forgetting about, the neighboring countries that they did all those kind of things. I mean, sometimes for us, it's easy to say, forget it. Because if we want future, we want to stick, we just want to bury the past atrocities, because that's the only way forward. But if we want to just dig into the past things, we can just bring up things which are unresolved and will not be resolved. I mean, if you have, as you rightly said, Pakistani leaders sitting in Pakistan under the protection of Pakistani government, or some elements inside the Pakistan. Yeah. So any international.
So let me break it down first of all by saying, in the post-2001 period, yes, there have been violations of international humanitarian law. But again, credit to the US military. When there is evidence, they investigate and they will prosecute individuals who have committed. So I think in the post-9/11 period, it hasn't been a perfect system, but there have been prosecutions and investigations of those who have committed violations against the Afghan people. I mean, the issue of, I think, what really irks Afghan is the immunities given to foreign soldiers for violations that they had committed. But I would say to you also that at least ISAF has been better at trying to bring justice to the Afghan people in terms of addressing violations, even in terms of compensation. The key challenge is going to be between that 1973 period to 2001.
In post-2001, don't forget the other regional actors, like Pakistanis and Iranians, so we cannot just completely...
Yes, but let me kind of deal with... first of all, I want to deal with the ISAF forces and emphasize that, again, they have really tried to take that under consideration. The 78 to 2001, undoubtedly, both the Saudis, the Iranians, again, members of the US government and many others had colluded and worked with the with the domestic actors in committing violations. we're not going to see prosecutions. I can almost guarantee that. This is where, again, an Afghan Truth Commission that will devote several chapters maybe of the official record to emphasize the violations that the external actors had committed might be a starting point. And say, listen, you know what, we have evidence that Ahmed Gul was responsible for some of the atrocities. We have evidence that senior Soviet generals were responsible. At least by recognizing them, we might, at some point later on, get some sort of international action against those individuals. In the post-9/11 period, in terms of Pakistan, Iran, some of the Central Asian republics, again, Saudi Arabia, people often forget the role that it has played and plays. We are unlikely to see it because it's realpolitik. But here again, the responsibility will fall, I would argue, on the shoulders of the Afghan people to simply begin some sort of a process. By first of all recognizing the crimes that Afghan had committed against Afghan, that starts the process. And then Afghans can turn around and say, you know what, we also want Ahmed Gul, we also want Pervez Musharraf, we also want other people, Prince Turkey, for example, to come and face the Afghan people and at least apologize for the role that they had played in turning Afghanistan into the graveyard that it was for such a long period. But I still argue that in political realism, we'll simply say it has to start with the Afghan people. Yeah.
But insofar as it has to start with the Afghan people, I think this is where Casey's point is important again, right? That you don't necessarily have a rule of law culture that's well established at the cultural level. And so what do you do about that? I mean, what do you do about the fact that you don't have not just institutions, but a sense of what could be possible in terms of justice?
Well, I would still argue for a Truth Commission. I'm a huge proponent. I believe that they kind of work because the Truth Commission create an official record. This is something that's definitely lacking in Afghanistan. Okay? At the moment, everybody's pointing at everybody and saying, you did this, you did that. We need to have some sort of an official record. Afghanistan does have a National Remembrance Day, which is a very important thing. It's going to be also very important to identify individuals who were martyred. The Truth Commission can do that. Again, we can talk about how to structure it, who should lead it. Okay? Well, it's unlikely to be an Afghan person. But we have examples of foreigners coming in and leading those type of institutions. I would advocate for a Muslim as opposed to a Westerner. Again, that could definitely work. There will have to be some sort of consultation with members of the different ethnic groups as to who should sit. Has to be an equal representation. It can be 17 commissioners. And that will definitely cover the broad spectrum. But for me, it will be a Truth Commission as opposed to trusting the Afghan judicial system. And I think this is kind of where it is. And I think the other thing with the Truth Commission that could really work, it's not about retribution. It's about allowing the ordinary Afghans to have what had happened to them and their families acknowledged. That's the start. Then you can say, you know what, we may have prosecutions for specific individuals. But the first thing is recognizing, because at the moment, I would argue there is no recognition. And that to me is the challenge.
Yeah. We had some success in Iraq with rule of law complexes. We built a fortified town, moved the judges and the prosecutors in there, and they had the opportunity then to try their cases without being intimidated by warlords and that kind of thing. Do you think that'd be beneficial to do that in Afghanistan?
Probably not. First of all, again, in the Iraqi judiciary, we actually had better trained judges. We had a more educated type of legal profession in Iraq. As skewed as it was, the evidence when a number of judges attended a training session in London, a lot of the sort of the foreign specialists said they were amazed that they were so familiar with international law, international criminal law, and so on. In Afghanistan, we don't see that yet. It's going to be a very long process. Now, again, we need to commend the fact that there have been a very clear emphasis to try to empower women to enter the judicial profession in Afghanistan. But it requires also a lot of social change. And this is where tribal elders, this is again where alternative dispute resolution could come into the equation and help the process. I think keeping the tribal aspect out is going to be problematic in Afghanistan. Whereas in Iraq, it could work. I mean, again, Iraq is a tribal society, but not to the extent that we see in Afghanistan. And this is also where, again, Islam will have to play a role. You know, religion plays a very important role in trying to mediate peace. You know, if we're looking at the South African Truth Commission, Archbishop Desmond Tutu always started the meeting with a prayer. You know, and it was across the board. Why can we not have it here? So, you know, it's always a problem sort of raising religion with Afghanistan because immediately people think Taliban. It isn't. You know, the Taliban phenomenon in Afghanistan, it's a new phenomenon. It really is a product of the Afghan jihad. It's something that, again, the Pakistanis need to bear responsibility for. Because under Zia-ul-Haq, he certainly pushed for that Deobandi, Wahhabi type of approach with the support of Saudi Arabia. So there has to be a lot more untangling of the process, but it's going to be very, very tricky. But this is a long-term process. The first thing is 2014. What's going to happen in the election? Make sure that there is political stability, and then maybe develop it.
Can I just add one thing to that? You're right that the Faculty of Law that produces attorneys, and the Sharia used to produce judges. I mean, it was really difficult that one based on Roman Germanic law and one purely Islam. So now, what for the past, at least since 2008, there is a 1-year training course funded by the U.S. government. So students graduating from these two faculties, they go both in this one, and usually they try to have the law students as the judges.
Yes.
So they try to train them to become judges, and that's based on the constitution, which is again, you know, respecting to the Islamic laws and religious principles. But it's based on the Roman Germanic, and you can call it a secular, you know.
But again, I mean,
you don't call it.
Yeah, but again, the University of Stanford has really led. They are running an initiative to do training in Afghanistan. But again, it's a relatively new thing. It's very much based on Kabul, and the tricky part is going to be the superior judges because they still come from the old tradition. So the first Chief Justice of the Afghan Supreme Court was the most orthodox conservative you can get. He was 73, I think, when he was elected. It was part of a political agreement with President Karzai, and he did so much to undermine the legal profession. He was there for about 5 or 6 years, and he appointed a lot of junior judges that are very similar to his outlook. You know, at one point, you know, he called for the, not the execution, but at least for the excommunication of a senior minister because allegedly she challenged Islam in a Canadian report. You know, Afghanistan had the Pop Idol. He argued that people, you know, it shouldn't be allowed because it challenges Islamic principles. So that chief judge created enormous damage to the Afghan judicial system that now has to be revised. Now, even the current Chief Justice, he's not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. And that's also a problem. So I think there's going to be a new crop of lawyers coming in, but it's going to take them at least 10 years to have any impact. And the challenge also with them is that the salaries are not sufficiently good. And this creates enormous amount of tension. So that's also something that needs to be addressed. Yes,
Hey, Professor. In Latin America, we have two cases about the truth commissions. We have the Salvadoran case that even it was revealed in 1992, the report, the judicial system didn't do anything, and because it was part of the peace, the Treaty of Chapultepec. But in Chile, we have two commissions, the 1991 and the 2005. Do you think Afghanistan, which one would be the approach? Because in the Chilean case, they wait until 2012 to prosecute 70-something officials in Chile. But they also wait 20 years to start the prosecutions, and which one do you think?
Well, again, the South America case is very interesting because what we see there are waves. Okay, so the first wave, really, as a number of the South American countries were transitioning out of authoritarian regimes, they had amnesty provision. I can't think of a single country not to have embraced an amnesty provision, and then it takes about 10, 15 years. There are a number of decisions by the Inter-American Court saying that amnesty provision challenge international criminal norm. There is Rodriguez Velasquez, there's a few others that kind of emphasize the need to change. But it really took a change in the mindset of the people of Chile, of Argentina, of El Salvador, recently of Guatemala, to really decide, you know what, now we're going to take those individuals to court. So this is kind of why when we're looking into South America, we have to take it as a two-step process. First of all, they work with what they had. Even in Argentina, I mean, the new government that replaced Perón basically said, listen, we are not going to go after these people because the military is just too powerful for us to challenge. And Carlos Nino writes this wonderful book, The Radical Evil, almost justifying the decision not to prosecute the military officers because he was so worried that there'll be a second revolution. But now when we're looking at the situation, we are seeing senior generals being brought to justice, or at least being brought to the court to defend some of their activities.
And do you think this could be an option for Afghanistan, or because we are against amnesties,
if I take the view of the dialectic that history is progressive, then sure, why not? In 20 years, in 40 years, Afghans would be strong enough and comfortable enough to be willing to challenge those individuals. Okay? Again, it's going to be problematic because most of them will be very, very old, but it's still going to be. And now again, I don't think it's likely to occur, but this is sort of where a truth commission could play some sort of a part. But because again, it's the issue of recognizing that something happened and that people suffered. And I don't think that really has come to the fore in Afghanistan. And this is why there is so much discord. A lot of the scholars in transitional justice often say the first thing that we need to do is get the two sides to talk, to recognize what had happened to them. Because individuals remember when violations had occurred against their families, and they want justice. Now, if you take the Pashtun element where honor and, there's a Pashtun sentence that says, I've taken my revenge after 100 years and I still took it too soon, right? If I'm correct, it's a very rough translation, okay? But but that's the idea, honor and the need to take revenge is very important. General McChrystal often said, if I kill one potential Taliban, I've actually created 10 others. This was kind of in the famous Rolling Stone article that he argued. We have to take that under consideration. But here again, where reconciliation, this is where Islam could play a part. Compensation. Monuments could also be very important. So that would be my argument.
Yes. How do you build traction for a truth commission? The Afghans, there's no political will, there's no money.
Yeah.
It has to come from the international community. The international community is pulling out. That funding source is drying up, and therefore that is a source of where do you see traction that you can actually build for?
Well, there have been some polls that the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission has run about asking people, do you want to see some form of reconciliation? And statistically speaking, the results have been sort of around 50% say, yes, we want to see something. When they're asking them, do you want to see retribution? Do you want to see prosecution? They say the numbers really sort of collapse because Afghans are realists. They know what's going to happen. So there is evidence that people want at least a recognition of what had happened. So this is again where a truth commission could come in. But this is where you do outreach programs. So if you're going to have an Afghan Truth Commission, one of the key emphasis here is going to be to travel around Afghanistan, to hold, you can't just have the meeting in Kabul or in some of the other major cities. It has to be in the towns. Now, here again, it's going to be important to focus on the seasons because that's going to be an issue. It's going to be important to recognize different languages, different traditions. But it's doable if we take a longer approach to it. Normally, truth commissions last for about a year or two. If we say, let's say, we'll do this over a 4 or 5 year period. And as part of the process, we'll engage in openness and then some sort of a discussion. It might work. But the outreach program is going to be absolutely crucial. And there are enough Afghan expats who I believe would be willing to help. Yes?
It seems to me that to implement in reality a truth commission, you really need to have a stable society. In a post-conflict situation. And I don't see this happening anytime soon, having in mind all this insurgency in Afghanistan. They are not really incentivized to be co-opted in the government or to accept the truth to the government because they really think they are winning. And without ISAF out of Afghanistan in 2014, I don't see this incentive on the table.
Well, undoubtedly some areas of Afghanistan are very problematic in terms of level of insurgencies, but to think that all of Afghanistan is engaged in low-intensity conflict, I think that's not the case in 2013, 2014. So again, one of the interesting things about Afghanistan is that if you are able to build momentum, it carries through. So I think, again, if we maybe start in some of the northern areas where there is less tension, I know that recently there's been an increase, but if we start maybe in the north, work our way down, it might build momentum. People might see that the commission is not trying to create discord, but rather bring people together. It might work. Now, we've had over 50 different truth commissions. Not all of them have worked in total peace situation. So, the issue of security is important, but I wouldn't put it as at a premium level. Now, again, spoilers may come in and try to dismantle or disrupt the work of the Truth Commission. But again, everything necessitates a risk. We're trying to build a peaceful Afghanistan. It has to come at some danger, unfortunately. I think it's 1 o'clock, so I think some people want to maybe leave. Thank you very much.